Hello and welcome. The Purdue Institute for the Study of the Iranian World welcomes you to another episode of our podcast, Legacies of Ancient Persia. Join us as we further explore the many legacies of ancient Persia and its relevance to global patrimony. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legacies of Ancient Persia. This week, our guest is Dr. Rolf Strootman, a professor of ancient history at the University of Utrecht. In this episode, we discuss the complexities surrounding the Persian identity after Alexander the Great's conquests, Alexander's unique approach to governance and cultural integration, particularly through his marriages to Persian women, the role of women in his life, and the aftermath of Alexander's death. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you like what you hear, please give our show a 5-star rating and review us on Apple or Spotify. Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining me this morning for me, I guess, afternoon or evening for you. And I would like to start us off with what I hope will be a kind of relatively easy question, and that is, how did you get into the field?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's late in the afternoon here in the Netherlands. How I got into this field? Well, I think that by field I should understand that as the field of the history of Iran in the Hellenistic period. It's a kind of a paradox. I'm focusing on the period in which Iranians are supposed not to have been very much at the forefront of history, and I think otherwise, of course. So yeah, how do you get in the field? The interest in ancient history goes back a long way. Reading books about the classical world and the Roman Empire, and then all of a sudden, I think somewhere in high school, I found out about this crazy period that hardly anyone writes about in popularizing books, which is the Hellenistic period. So the period from Alexander the Great to, traditionally we would say, the coming of the Romans. I would say the coming of the Parthians is also very important as a watershed. But that's something else. But this period that is hard to find anything about when you're 12 years old. But yeah, it promises to be very, very interesting. It had all these kings and princesses and shifting, quickly changing fortunes of war. It has war elephants, it has huge battleships, it has the goddess Isis. So there are all kinds of things that drew me into the Hellenistic period. Iran came in somewhat later. After I already became a professional scholar, I lived in Los Angeles, of all places, for half a year in an exchange program. I taught Hellenistic history at UCLA. And there I used the library to read a lot about what was going on in Iran during these 3 centuries that we traditionally call the Hellenistic period. And I found out there's a kind of a gap. We don't know much about it. There is some literature. There was one of the first things I read is a very good book by Joseph Wieseheuvel on Persia under the Seleucids. So I tried to find more information there that brought me into contact. When I was there with Rahim Shayagan and also Turash Daryai, who invited me over to Irvine to give a lecture, and then I thought, well, this lecture should be about, this is like 10 years ago or something, this lecture should be about Iran in my period. So I started to prepare that. And well, so slowly, I started to develop my ideas about what was going on in Iran in the so-called Hellenistic period. And the main problem is, the main research question that I'm trying to answer, a very broad one, is basically what happened in between. So after Alexander, Persians are supposed to have disappeared from view, from history, more or less. And then less than a century later, they all of a sudden return again. So the question is, what happened there? Were they underground? Were they chased off? Did they hide for these so-called Greeks? They weren't Greeks, who took over power, and did they resist? And was there then a Persian revival? That's a traditional narrative. The idea that the Hellenistic period in Iran ended with the so-called Persian revival, which is a kind of colonial resistance against supposedly Greeks and Macedonians who were in the past conceptualized as Westerners and Europeans, and therefore their rule was conceptualized as a kind of European colonial rule over Iran. I don't think that's right. I don't think Greece is part of Europe. Ancient Greece is part of Europe at all. But there's a lot of work to be done to challenge this idea of colonial resistance, of nations, of national resistance to Greek rule. It turned out to be much more complicated than that. It turns out that Iranians were very important in this period as rulers, as administrators, as leaders of armies. So they didn't disappear and then resist and created and came back. No, their culture developed in these centuries after Alexander. And finally, they took over. And finally, we had kind of a culture, a court culture, or dynastic identities. We know nothing about normal people living there, but dynastic identities, which were Persianistic, in which the memory of the ancient Achaemenid Empire was used to create new identities for new dynasties who came to power. What you can also call the Aranicate world, which is so important in later periods of history, notably the early modern periods, when all these empires from the Ottoman Empire to the Mughals are making big leaps now, all have a kind of a shared Persian culture. I think that starts in the Hellenistic period, the Aranicate cultures of, well, Western Eurasia, where you see them all. Okay, but that's a giant leap. So we agreed to talk about the beginning of all that. So rather the end of the Achaemenid period, but the beginning of the development of other new Persian identities among the ruling elites. And that means starting with Alexander the Third, or Alexander of Macedon, as he is also known. Or Alexander the Great is what, because otherwise then everybody knows who you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes, well, he is the Alexander. Now, whether we should be calling him the Great, I know is a popular modern topic of debate. But let's get into him because he is such a fascinating figure. As a classicist, I sadly had a few classes on the Hellenistic period, but we do skip over a lot and kind of tend to focus just on his campaigns and his death, which I think is very sad and regrettable. But then again, I suppose undergrad degrees, you don't have time to sort of really get into what he was like and specific policies. And so I want to kind of pick up I want to pick up at his conquests into Persia, because obviously we have his famous conquest of Babylon and his sort of chase of Darius and all this, but also specifically related to your researches. I believe, he really broke some ancient barriers by marching into Persia and then taking a Persian wife. So this seems to be kind of unheard of before. So I would really love it if you could tell us a little bit more about what does this mean? How does this change the world that he is living in? And how does that impact kind of further generations of intermarriage and all these wonderful things that will happen afterward?
Yes, well, thank you. This is a good way to start. The royal wives, the Persian wives of Alexander. Everything about Alexander is controversial. We still don't know how to really judge him. Is he a mass murderer? Is he a dictator? Yes. Did he also do good things? Well, no, but let's not go into those things. But the wives may be crucial. The Persian women surrounding Alexander. And you said this is really a new thing. That is true. There are no earlier Macedonian kings who had Persian or otherwise, if I may use the word for convenience, Oriental wives. They married broadly, sometimes around the Aegean, in the Balkans, etc., etc. But to understand, I think, Alexander's position vis-à-vis the Persians and Iran, we also, I think, we have to go a little bit back in time to the so-called classical periods of ancient Greece. Now, for Macedonia, that's more dubious. That's another huge controversy, how Greek Macedonia was. Let's not talk about that. But the classical period in Greece, which I normally prefer to call the Persian periods, because the Persian Empire, from a world history perspective, is more crucial, is more significant. It's the main political, economic, and cultural power in the whole of Western Eurasia, whereas classical only pertains to Greece. But let's call it for convenience, the classical period. So go a little bit further back in time. The old idea that there is a huge watershed, a gap between, on the one hand, between these two supposed civilization, the European, Western, Greek one on the one hand, and the Oriental Persian one on the other hand. Well, we know, of course, that is nonsense. But probably we also tend to underestimate the influence of the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, outside its supposed borders. In the 4th century, we're talking about the later 4th century with Alexander, BCE, the Persian Empire really managed to get back. There is a lot of, you could call it a Persian hegemony, or perhaps a kind of Persian koine of rulers and satraps in the Aegean. So the Persians, the Persian Empire, one way or other, was very much present, even in mainland Greece, but they were definitely present in Macedonia. So the Macedonian kings, the Macedonian court was in constant contact, perhaps not so much with the Achaemenid imperial court, but with all these smaller courts around the Aegean, in the western parts of what is now Turkey. There were satraps, there were kings, and those were the peers of the Argead dynasty of Macedonia. This is where they looked for. They looked for their, well, models for kingship, for the ways to behave as a king, for their art. It all comes from Western Anatolia. So Macedonia is already, although peripheral from a Persian perspective, somehow connected to the Achaemenid Empire in a certain sense, culturally part of the Achaemenid Empire. So Alexander knew where he was going. He knew that culture, and when he was taking over aspects of Persian imperial ideology, he already knew that. He was aware of that. One of the things that we often tend to forget is that during his campaigns, Alexander never ever left the Achaemenid Empire. So he's not the explorer going to new unknown worlds. He knew exactly where he was going. He never left the empire's borders, if there were borders, of course. He had guides, so he knew where he was going. He was in a world which was to some extent familiar to him. Okay, and now the wives. So Alexander may have had already these plans and these developed during his short campaign. I don't think he entered his campaign with plans of marrying Persian queens and becoming a new Achaemenid ruler. All that developed not slowly but quickly. It's hardly 10 years or so. But we see a very strong tendency among Alexander to marry these queens, and there is a problem there. Alexander is always accused of not having secured a successor before he left Macedonia, but he was very young when he did that. And he absolutely tried to secure his successors. He had 2 sons. He may have had more children, but 2 sons who survived him and who could have succeeded him. Both of them had Iranian mothers. So what was the problem? Where was I going? The problem that I want to see is that where we think that Alexander may not have had a real plan, he may have had a real plan. There must have been some notion that perhaps it's the evidence for another old controversy. Was he planning to take over the whole Achaemenid Empire, or was that an idea that only came to existence somewhat later? Well, probably a little bit later, but he is his treatment of Persian women. Well, but let's talk about these Persian women. There are so many, and I don't have all the answers. I know that there are different opinions among my colleagues. There are some who say that the Persian women at Alexander's court were kind of prisoners, were hostages. That it wasn't the story that Alexander treated the Persian women who became captives at his court after the Battle of Issos in 333 BCE. The story is that Alexander treated them very courteously. Some of my colleagues doubt that, if that was really the case. But what was really the case is that they were extremely important. Shall we talk about them? There are many of them. There's, of course, the famous story of how after the Battle of Issos in the west of the Middle East, now in Turkey, Alexander captured at Damascus the whole family of his Persian adversary, Darius III, including Darius's mother, Sisugambis. and Darius' wife, Statera, and also the children of Darius. And the ideas, I think that Sabine Müller argued that, I'm not sure if it's published already. She thinks of them as also some kind of hostages. But the story is that Alexander had very good relations with Darius' mother. And he may at that moment already have gotten the idea how to use these women in another way. Sorry for using such terminology, but this is about power politics, and Alexander the Great is not a nice person. How to use them for his own political aims. And his aim tended to be to somehow marry himself, because that's what he did in the end. So we know that for sure. Marry himself into the Achaemenid dynasty, into the family, the ruling family. Now, marrying into that family by marrying a woman from that family does not make you part of the family. But if you manage to beget a son by one of these royal women, then your son will be an official successor to the throne. And as children tend to take a long time before they become adults, so they are what's the word? They are minors for at least 16 years, which would make the father the regent of the official successor. And that's something that Alexander had very much in mind. Marrying these Achaemenid women, becoming the father of their sons, and thereby himself the father of official claimants to the Achaemenid throne. Something that he could not entirely claim himself, although he went a long way to there. But that started already shortly after Issos, to which, and that's the interesting thing, I think it must be some 12 months after the Battle of Issos in 333 BCE, where he captured Darius' wife, Statera, and then I don't have the time at the top of my head at the moment, but let's say 12 months after she was captured, she died in childbirth, which means that Darius will not have been the father of that child. There are some objections. There's another source who says that her son already, etc., etc. So chances are that Alexander tried to father a child with her as his first attempt, which failed. But his good relations with Darius' mother and Darius' wife were also important. And then later, at the so-called mass weddings of Susa, where Alexander, in another controversial act, the so-called creation of a unity of Persians and Macedonians, married his Macedonian soldiers to their Iranian wives. They already had Iranian women with them, or Oriental women, to use that word again for convenience. Alexander at Susa, one of the capitals of the Persian Empire, and in the eyes of the Greeks, the main capital of the Persian Empire, which was not Persepolis for the Greeks, but which was Susa. He married two daughters of his adversary, but that time already dead, Darius III. And as we are already throwing names, the daughters are another Statera, daughter of Statera and Darius. She's also called Barsine, and a daughter called Parysatis, who was not a daughter of Darius, but who was a daughter of the previous king, Artaxerxes III. But was very strongly trying to marry, to get into the Achaemenid family there. He also married another daughter of Darius called Trupaitis, with his main favorite, Hephaestion, the second in command, who died shortly after. So there's also no child there. And then, of course, who have we got? We've got the first Statera, who dies in childbirth. Then there is the second youngest Statera, whom he marries. She is murdered shortly after Alexander's death. And then we have Parysatis. I think we don't know what really happens with her. Another, the daughter of Artaxerxes III. There is before them. Now I'm terribly confusing it. But before them, Alexander had a concubine who was also Persian, as she was of very high birth. She is called Barsine. She was the daughter of the satrap of Phrygia, Tabassos. So very important aristocratic Iranian woman, formerly the wife of Alexander's. But I should stop dropping names. No, I won't stop dropping names. There's another name that will come later in a few minutes. But this Barsine, daughter of Artabas also Phrygia, formerly the wife of Memnon, Alexander's Greek adversary in the Aegean. Alexander took her, or she became Alexander's concubine. Now, her high birth, as well as what we know about how royal courts function, show that this was not just what we think when we think of a concubine. A concubine or a maîtresse can be a person of very high status who has direct access to the king. And we also know that after Alexander's death, the son that he had with her, called Heracles, a dynastic name, Alexander was descendant from Heracles, of course, so that this son was an official candidate for the Macedonian throne. So there was an official son who was half Iranian. Now, the last name, of course, that we should also mention here is the most famous queen of Alexander, which is Roxanne, who is also an Iranian. She's not Persian, but she's an Iranian from Central Asia, from Bactria. And her father was an important satrap or local ruler there. And they also had a son, and that is who became Alexander's official successor, Alexander the Fourth. That must be my last name for the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fascinating when, an expert such as yourself can really tell us about all the different marriages and the intricacies. Because forgive me, I'm going to bring in a very bad Hollywood adaptation, but the Alexander film is the Oliver Stone from 2004. If anyone listening has seen it, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. But they do this quite strange Oriental portrayal of Roxana, but they sort of tell us, that this is the one wife that sort of he treasures, and she has the official heir, and they don't really say anything about any of his other wives. And I think it's quite interesting because I had to find some documentary or some book that actually told me about his famously good relations with the wife and mother of Darius. And so I said, to me, that I think is more interesting, more engaging. I mean, that's the literal wife and mother of your great rival that he has chased through a half of Persia and up into the mountains. And so, if you'll allow me, like, why do you think we don't really talk about that relationship as much? Because I find that personally much more interesting than Roxana. No offense to Roxana and the people who love her, but yeah.
Yeah, that's our traditions for some reason. And Roxanne, or you pronounce her Roxana, right? That sounds good. Maybe a very political marriage in the end. Although on the other hand, she is the mother of the official successor in the end. Yeah, the others have more or less disappeared from our popular imagination of Alexander. Although at some point they were there. So let's say European Renaissance and early modern periods. There was this famous episode related by Plutarch about the capture of of the family of Darius. There are many paintings there. There's the famous one by Tiepolo. No, not Tiepolo, by Tiepolo. Okay, wait. Let me rephrase. There are many paintings made of that scene, and the scene is where Sysigambis and her children and her grandchildren are led before Alexander, and then supposedly they kneel down. I'm not really sure if that's, well, they're probably not kneeling to a king, but they must have done something to ask for asylum or something like that. And then they kneel down or they turn themselves to the wrong person. And that person is Alexander's friend, Hephaestion. And Hephaestion is a little bit taller than Alexander because Alexander was a very short man. And then when they notice their mistake, they supposedly, this is a story by Plutarch, right? So it's not true. They supposedly become very afraid that they may have offended Alexander. And then Alexander says something like, never mind, Hephaestion too is Alexander. And this is the story about generosity and about Alexander's great heart and his great friendship or whatever it was with Hephaestion. So for various reasons, they found this a really good story, notably in the Renaissance and early modern periods when the story was very popular. The story can be explained, meanwhile, from a kind of a court culture perspective. I started my career as a court historian, so I'm always thinking of How does the court function? How can we explain this in terms of court culture? And the idea here is probably that what existed, one of the things that existed between Alexander and Hephaestion is that they were bound by something that the ancient Greeks called philia. Courtiers are called philoi, friends, what it means in the Hellenistic period. And to be a friend of someone else is to be like that other person. If you are someone's friend, you are that person. You have the same things that you work for. So probably it means something like that. That Alexander says, Hephaestion is my other self because he is the second person. He is my favorite, the second person in the empire. But that has disappeared. The story. It will be told probably in biographies of Alexander. No, it's a pity too that Oliver Stone never did that. Things can be said about the scene with Roxanne. Probably the only chance in the scenario to really bring in a non-European character into the movie. Well, there's also the eunuch Bagoas, but well, yeah.
Yeah, there are a lot of creative decisions in the Oliver Stone film that I don't entirely understand. And, it would be great if I could speak to Oliver Stone about some of the decisions, but that's probably not going to happen. So sadly, I will just stick to my own speculations. But okay, so what I want to do though is you have mentioned the official heir, obviously, Roxana's son, and you briefly mentioned this idea that most people are kind of unaware and they think that Alexander had no sort of succession plan, which is why his empire fell apart and was divided between his generals. So I want to get into that a little bit if that sounds good, because just for the rest of the audience, I think based on certain sources, some films, we say, yeah, they had a son, but we kind of assume, or I at least assume that, well, how history went, they probably wanted to kill him off real quick and kind of shove him to the ash heap of history so they could sort of write the history they wanted. So what actually happened after Alexander's death with his named successor? I mean, he was there and I believe that being confined to the bounds of sort of what was quote unquote acceptable ways of getting rid of someone back then differed a lot from what we kind of assume now. So yeah, how did they get rid of him and what happened?
They got rid of them in the end, but it took surprisingly long. That's one of the things. So it may be considered a kind of a modern myth that Alexander never cared about his succession because he did. He never planned on dying when he was only 30, 32 or 33 or something. He died too young to do that. He married perhaps not very young. And the reason that he never married a Macedonian wife probably was that he wanted to marry higher up, which he did in the end. And he had two children. So, but he never, dying young was not part of his plans. That's one of the things that we can be sure of. And then there's another cliche, another myth that you just mentioned. After his death, his empire fell apart. That too is not entirely true. There was a huge civil war, if you can call it that, amongst Macedonian generals, the wars of the successors. It's kind of a world war. I always call it the really first world war, because fighting is taking place in Egypt, in Afghanistan, in Thrace, in Macedonia, in the Middle East, in Iran, everywhere. And so this is a really big conflict that lasts for two generations almost. But when in the end the fighting stops, Alexander's empire has not really fallen apart. It has been divided in three other empires, or dynasties known as the Antigonids, Seleucids, and Ptolemies. And each of them are quite big. The Seleucid Empire in Asia is a huge empire in the beginning. But it also means that all the former Persian Empire, the entire landmass of the Persian Empire, remains in the hands of Macedonian dynasties. So there are three of them, and they are warring among each other, but it doesn't really fall apart that much. But what happens with his sons? Well, you can say they are, of course, they're killed as soon as possible. But apparently, possible is not very soon. They are kept alive for quite a long time. The official successor, Alexander IV, who was, another interesting thing, proclaimed king when he was not yet born. So the general said, we want him as king. If it is a boy, of course, the son of Roxanne, But he remained alive until he became more or less became an adult. He was murdered by one of the diadoques, Cassander, in Macedonia, but they kept him alive for a long time. So they needed them. So they needed the idea that Alexander's dynasty was still ruling the whole of it. And his other successor, which was not the main successor, but some people claimed he was, Heracles, also was kept alive for a long time. So instead of being immediately murdered, these successors, these generals, found them very important, and they ruled for quite some time, little less than 20 years, official in their name before becoming kings themselves. Another thing that is more difficult to explain, perhaps, these two successors, especially Alexander IV. There was another successor, but let's not talk about him. It's complicated. They are operational. They are brought mainly to the west for some reason. So they are not used at this moment to pacify Iran, to build up alliances with the Persian aristocracies over there. But for some reason, they function most of all in the wars surrounding the country of Macedonia itself. That's something that we should still try to find an explanation for. Why didn't they use them for some other? For there is one of the generals, probably the most successful one, another perhaps unfamiliar name. His name is Seleucus. He is one of those generals who married an Iranian wife in these mass weddings orchestrated by Alexander himself in the Persian capital of Susa, where all the generals took Persian wives. They all remained married to them. There was another myth that they divorced them because they were not Greeks. That is not true. None of them known to have divorced them. But there's only one for whom his Iranian wife became the mother of his successor, and this is Seleucus. He married a Sogdian or Bactrian princess, perhaps of Achaemenid descent. He may already had a relationship with her when he was in Central Asia, but he officially married her later. And their son, who was half Iranian, half Macedonian, called Antiochus, became the successor of the Seleucid Empire. And why was Seleucus so very successful? In the end, he created the largest successor empire of all, was the fact that Seleucid had good relations with Iranians. And there is debate, but you can be sure, even without evidence, you can be quite sure that his Iranian wife, she's called Apama, a name that will later recur in this dynasty, where princes and princesses more often had Iranian names, that she played some kind of diplomatic role in creating these alliances. How do we know that Seleucus, the main successor of Alexander, was successful in pacifying some Iranian aristocrats? And that's the fact that there were enormous amounts of Iranian troops in his army, mainly from Central Asia and mainly horsemen. Now that, if I may go back a little bit earlier too, is also one of the reasons why Alexander, apart from fighting the Persians, apart from burning down Persepolis and doing all those nasty things, also wanted to pacify the aristocracy. The aristocracy in Iran was still in control of the land, and they had access to the military resources of the former Achaemenid Empire. Empires are military organizations. What imperial rulers want is troops or money to pay for their troops. So it's very important to have good relations with the people who control Iran and Central Asia. Central Asia at that time also had Iranian-speaking elites. So it's part of the larger Iranian world at that time. And Alexander's successor, Seleucus, understood that very well. And he too managed to, like Alexander, to get into his armies huge amounts of Iranian horsemen, heavy horsemen, horse archers from Central Asia. And that too is probably one of the main reasons why Alexander also wanted to pacify Iranians, wanted to become friends with Iranians. And that is also where perhaps this idea of the fusion of the Iranians and Macedonians comes from. He needed resources of the Achaemenid Empire. He also needed to pacify the Macedonians, who were not always his supporters.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I had truly appreciated beforehand how important a role the Iranians had and played, both during Alexander's life and afterwards, and how important it was to maintaining control of kind of basically certain sections of the empire after. I do want to get to kind of Iranians after Alexander, as you've mentioned. Let's get into sort of the aftermath of we had, the mass marriages, which I think is a fascinating fact that I didn't know until very recently. But I do want to just rewind a little bit because during our conversation about sort of the importance and the pronounced role of women during the sort of life of Alexander and everything after, he had a very famous mother, right? Olympias. There's a lot of mythology around her, a lot of plots and other things. So she's kind of shrouded half in legend, half in real history from what we can piece together. And then, we're led to believe things like the Oliver Stone Alexander. We might have this impression that after Alexander decided he was going to go east and sort of, press on and wage more war, that he sort of left his mother against some of her wishes and then wrote her letters, but he kind of kept her at arm's length. And so we don't really hear. Well, I don't remember hearing, how did she feel about his marriages to Iranian women? How did she feel? I mean, I think, right, there's this idea that, well, his mother probably would have wanted him to marry a Macedonian woman, but we don't really know. So, just do we have evidence? Would you like to take a guess? But like, what did she think about this whole, I'm going to go in and, I'm going to perhaps try to father a child with Darius, the great enemy's wife, or I'm going to take, Roxana and all these other women. So did she have any kind of input on this? Or was it just, no, I'm going to do it. And then.
Great question. Especially you're giving me the possibility to speculate. That's what you said. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, mommy should agree, of course. Daddy was dead, but anyway, mommy's more important. No, absolutely. A few things can be said about that. These letters that he wrote her are later formations, but he did remain in close contact with her. So he probably did write letters, but the letters that have come down to us are not very original. Neither are the letters that he wrote to Aristotle, who was absolutely not very important in the life of Alexander. That's also something that's. But his mother, well, would she have preferred him to marry a Macedonian girl? Perhaps not. His mother, Olympias, was not Macedonian. She came from a neighboring country called Epirus, which is in the northwest of Greece, partly in the south of Albania. That's why in the Oliver Stone movie, the actress Angelina Jolie speaks with this very strange kind of Eastern European accent. This is to suggest that she's Albanian. But she came from that. She came from that region. The people from that region were considered more Greek, by the way, by the Greeks than the Macedonians. But never mind that. She may have, if I may really want to speculate, what she would have preferred was that Alexander would have married someone from her own family, if such a person existed. I'm not sure there. That could be imaginable. Not probably in Macedonia. They both had a problem with the Macedonian aristocracy. All kings usually have a problem with their own aristocracy. Aristocracies are powerful. They have the right to walk up to the king and ask things, and the king usually has no opportunity to say no when asked something. That's where you're a king for. You always say yes. So the aristocracy is extremely powerful. And the whole history of Alexander is not just a conflict with the Persians, with Darius III. It's also a conflict with the Macedonian nobility. And he worked together with his mother against the Macedonian nobility. When he left, two people were left in charge. A male Macedonian nobleman, never mind his name, because the name eludes me at the moment, and his mother. So the one was the official regent of the Macedonian state, to call it that, and his mother was in control more or less of the court. And they hated each other. And that probably was Alexander's intent. He wanted to divide power in Macedonia while he was away. So both his mother and the other guy whose name now eludes me. Well, never mind. I will think of him later. But on the other hand, what we do know is that when Roxana and her son, Alexander IV, reached Macedonia, Olympias, Alexander's mother, became their patron, their protector. So she ruled officially as a queen of Macedonia because she was the grandmother of the king, if you can follow me. Alexander was dead. His son Alexander IV was king. So Olympias was the closest relative for that king. So she became the official regent. So she supported Roxana and the claims of Alexander IV against the wishes of a new ruler in Macedonia, Cassander, another very nasty person, but they're all quite nasty. And he is the one who finally defeated Olympias and killed Alexander's son and Roxana. And Olympias killed the other son.
They're all kind of doing terrible things. But, I guess it's better to have mommy on your side than against you is the lesson that I kind of take from all of this. As simplistic as that may be, it's very true. That's fascinating. I mean, I've always been very intrigued by Olympias as a figure. I mean, she's a powerful woman. She had this son who kind of tried to conquer half the world. So it's a very interesting position that she's in. Now, I want to make sure we have time to talk about after Alexander. And as you alluded to, I think at the beginning of our conversation, we have this idea that as soon as Alexander is gone and we have the wars of succession, that the Persians just kind of blink out of the spotlight and we don't really hear from them for a while. But I'm sure, like all things in history, it is shrouded in mystery, and that is not true. So what did happen to the, just general Iranian people? I mean, obviously, we're going to have more things to say about aristocracies that survive and stuff. But what about those who aren't sort of in those powerful positions? Sure, they didn't just kind of go away and not exist.
You mean the ones who are not noble, aristocratic? We know little about them. They were still there. The aristocracies too were still there, and the farmers, the troop. What we do know is that if that may be some kind of an indication in later Macedonian or Hellenistic armies, there are so many Iranian troops. That means that the Iranians are still there, but there are so many people. So Iran can mean two things, of course. It can be a huge landmass inhabited by very different people speaking many different languages. Or it can refer to the people who have Iranian identities, and that too is very, very difficult to define what that is. It has something to do with religion, because not all Persians and Iranians spoke Persian. They probably all spoke, many of them spoke Aramaic at that time. So it's very difficult to say who is who. It's probably always often our ideas about nations and people that we project upon them, trying to recognize who is who in this world. And that's very difficult. These kind of identities, you can really find them all. I'm sorry for that. If you look at the aristocracies, because they adopt those identities sometimes. They do adopt Persian identities. Now, the Persians, if I may define the Persians as the people who come from the region what the Greeks call Persis or Parsa, present-day Fars, in the southwest of present-day Iran, they become less and less important. So it seems that it's almost as if Alexander is trying to appease and ally himself to different kinds of Iranian aristocracies and the people they rule, but rather less the Persians, the real members of the Achaemenid family. They are there at first. The brother of Darius is a loyal supporter of Alexander. The satrap of Babylonia, Mazaios, becomes a loyal supporter of Alexander. The later satrap of Bactrio, Artabas, also a very powerful person in the Achaemenid Empire, becomes a loyal supporter of Alexander. The later Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC is very important. There Darius was really defeated. And as Persian kingship is very martial, and the king is the one who should lead his people to victory. If he doesn't, then you may need another king, or it may show that the gods are not entirely on the side of the king. And Alexander may have profited from that. We don't know exactly, we don't have to prove, but we do know that after that battle, several Persian nobles go over to Alexander's side, and they bring with them their troops, and that's where the normal people perhaps are, but we have no idea about their ethnic identity, if such a thing existed. Well, it existed, but we don't know exactly what it is. what it means. But one of the puzzling things that's also there is that Alexander burned down Persepolis, or parts of it, when we know from archaeological evidence that the burning down of Persepolis was not just some accident, as some of our Greek sources pretend it was. There were two reasons why this accidentally happened. They were drunk, and you do stupid things. And of course, it was all the idea of a bad woman. We know now that this is absolutely not true. We know that the burning of Persepolis was very well organized. It were only several buildings that were destroyed, namely specifically those built by King Xerxes, the king who had invaded a long time before that time Greece. And the burning was prepared well in advance. Everything, archaeologists found nothing in terms of smaller objects in the ceremonial rooms of Persepolis. So everything must have been taken out in advance as booty, and burning material was piled up in these buildings. So it was all prepared well in advance as a kind of a statement. And what statement, we don't know. Perhaps a kind of revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece, to satisfy the Greeks who were with Alexander and who were in Greece looking at what was happening. Perhaps it was also kind of a signal that the Achaemenids were finished, but not necessarily anti-Iranian more generally. But we see after that, under Alexander's successors, a trend in which other parts of Iran become important. So first of all, media, that's the area a little bit to the now along hundreds of kilometers to the north of Persis, becomes important as a provider of war horses. Some parts of northern Iran become important, and Bactria in present-day Afghanistan, another Iranian-speaking region, becomes very important. So the Macedonians work together with Iranians, but from other parts than the original heartlands of the Achaemenid Empire. Or as far as the Greeks knew about that, my colleague Iran Almagor has one time at a conference showed very clearly that there was no Greek literature before some centuries after Alexander's death that ever mentioned Persepolis. The Greeks had no idea about, well, perhaps they had some idea, but they didn't write about Persepolis at all. The capital for them was Susa. That's where they sent their embassies to. So Persepolis is not entirely the most important part in the eyes of the Greeks, which is Susa, which was not destroyed, which became a capital. So to answer your question, what happens after that? Well, the normal people, they're always there. And in terms of aristocracies, we see an increasing importance of Iranian administrators and military people in later Hellenistic, especially Seleucid armies. It starts already after Alexander's death. Alexander used Iranian horsemen a lot. His successors fought battles among each other with these huge amounts of Persian or Iranian, I should say, Iranian horsemen. And the Seleucids continued that. And what I think happened in the centuries after that is that the successors of Alexander, in opposition to their own Macedonian aristocracies, start to yield more power to Iranian aristocracies. And they start to create small dynasties, small independent kingdoms that will eventually survive into the Parthians. That's very political.
No, it's great to know. I mean, oh man, I wanted to be able to try to shoehorn a question further in time using your own work with Antiochus III and even maybe later. But I feel like that might be a little out of left field considering the conversation we've had. So I'm going to keep it a bit tighter. So instead, I'm going to ask you a fun sort of media question. So we've talked a lot about and referenced the 2004 Oliver Stone Alexander film. And obviously we have the new sort of Netflix docudrama series on Alexander, Making of a God, that dropped on Netflix, I think this past winter. Can I just ask you what you think of both of those? Because they do differ a lot in their approaches to storytelling. And also as an add-on to this question of what do you think of each of these works, if you were in charge of being able to create your own Alexander film or TV show, what would you do that's different or similar to both of these works that are existing?
Yes. Well, I hopefully would make a film that is less boring. than the other two. Oliver Stone's movie is excellently done in terms of how everything looks. So, notably, the military clothing is absolutely correct. But one of the things, of course, that happened there is that the Persians are depicted really as the other. So the use of Orientalistic stereotype is is strong there, even though it doesn't really, not always, but the depiction of Babylon with all these courtesans and the hanging gardens, which looks like awful. The Persian king wearing makeup, he may have done that, but it's meant so much to create difference. The Netflix series does that too. And I think it does an even better job there because it pretends to be more told from a Persian perspective, but it doesn't. One of the things that you immediately notice if you are a little bit of a military history nerd, you will notice that the Persians wield scimitars, these curved sabers. They were the Greeks had curved swords, and the Persians had straight swords. So this must be, and the swords that they use are taken very directly from 19th century Orientalistic painting. So this is a conscious choice to make them look more Oriental or more strange or more othered than us. So probably it would that different, and I would also make other choices in the screen time given to the interviewees. I know that a lot of people were interviewed, but they really prefer parts in which the traditional image of Alexander is maintained. Some of them give that to him, and some of them think, okay, well, this is what you want, I give it. So that's and they get a lot of time. And but one of the things, there's another colleague of ours in California who also was flown into to in London, and he very certainly told a more nuanced story, telling Alexander's story from the Persian perspective, and he gets hardly any screen time. At least he got out of it because that's not what the public, what the audience wants to see. So that's the problem. If you do not give the audience what it wants, your movie will also be a failure. Probably, if you want to be historically correct, people may not be very interested in that. And then Oliver Stone is a whole other question. He's a political filmer. So that movie is about what was it again, 1993 or something like that. It's about the United States. It's about the invasion of Iraq. I'm not sure if I got the dates right, but it has to do with the American unit.
Yeah, because I believe, yeah, it came out in 2004. Yeah, well, it's quite evident. Although, I think my favorite little detail though from the Oliver Stone is they got Alexander's famous hairstyle, the Anastal. It looks right,
Yeah,
which is always a fun little detail because I guess it's not the sort of detail I maybe would be looking for. That's not the first thing that would jump to mind is, did you get this right? But it was kind of a happy accident that I suppose it was. So.
looking for that. Yeah, but outwardly, everything looks very great, except of course for the question: was he really blonde?
Yeah, that on the other hand, I was like, well, that and then the fun fact that I always love to tell people is when people say, why was Alexander Irish? Well, it's just because Colin Farrell, who I suppose they didn't want to recast, he literally couldn't get rid of his accent. And so they said, okay, well, we'll just make everyone else, we'll make all the Macedonians Irish just so we show they're different. And I thought that was hilarious. So,
Well, to still answer your question, what I would do different, I wouldn't depict the Macedonians as Europeans, nor the Greeks. It's a culture that's of course a culture of its own, but it's part of a wider Eastern Mediterranean, Near Eastern worlds. If Europe has nothing, it doesn't really exist as a concept, but that's still how we frame it. This is why Alexander must be blonde. This is why there must be Western Europeans. Could he find a Greek actor to play him? I mean, no, I would depict him as far more integrated in the Near East than is usually done.
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think that would be bold. I would really love to see something made by historians, experts, not just Hollywood folks. But I do understand the intricacies of making things in Hollywood these days. So I don't really think that's going to happen anytime soon. All I can say is I hope someone will call you up and ask you to be a historical consultant because you could set them maybe more straight than what we've gotten in the past. So I will hope for that for you. Yeah. So I hate running out of time with my guests because, of course, we start talking and then there's 10,000 more things that I would love to be able to ask and talk to you about. But sadly, I have to move us along to our final two questions. But, and hopefully these will still be fun, or maybe that's the wrong word, but thought-provoking.
Interested in learning more about the wonders of ancient Persia? Visit the UCLA Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran. The Gazetteer digitally preserves famous locations, World Heritage sites, and lesser known areas from all time periods of ancient Iranian history. You can explore using the interactive map or visit the encyclopedic catalog for updates to the ever-growing list of archaeological sites. Visit www.irangazetteer.ucla.edu and learn more about what the Archaeological Gazetteer of Iran has to offer.
So, the first of the final two questions I normally ask on our show is what, in your opinion, is the greatest legacy left to us from ancient Persia?
Wow. The greatest legacy of ancient Persia. Well, if you're looking at the world today, oh, that's very difficult. I can talk about the legacy in later centuries. So the Iranicates, Persianate cultures, poetry, and the wine, and all those things that Europeans romanticized about Persia. You can also say the great legacy is empire, but it is not really the kind of empire that we still have. So in later centuries, that would be an important thing. But I would define, of course, and many people who do that define the Persian legacy in cultural terms as one of the great, I shouldn't really be saying this, one of the great civilizations of the world. Why I should not be saying that? Because then I'm still dividing the world up into civilizations. And to call Persia a great civilization is still a way to make it look different from Western civilization, where there's a lot of overlap, of course. But yes, I'm a romantic. I think I would perhaps define it in such cultural terms as everything that's well knowing that part of it is 19th century European ideas about Persia. But yes, and well, there's their influence on Islam. There's yeah.
It's intentionally meant to be a difficult question because obviously there are so many and it's impossible to pick just one. So this is me doing a thought exercise of I'm trying to needle you on just one, but it's okay. Yes, the answer really is there are many.
There's absolutely probably putting Persia on the same on a par with classical Greece.
Yes, yes. I mean, it deserves to be.
Yeah.
Well, our second question is what do you think would be the best legacy that we as scholars today can leave for future students of Iranian studies?
I would perhaps think of it as a kind of in terms of scholarly legacy for students of world history, not just Iranian studies. But what I'm doing in my teaching here in Utrecht and in many of my writings is trying to redefine the geographical focus of ancient history. In the past, it was always that ancient history is about the history of the Mediterranean. And then, in fact, it was always about Greece and Rome, notably. But one of the things that you can do by pointing out, by teaching Achaemenid history or Iranian history more general, but also by teaching Hellenistic history, the Hellenistic world also extends from, well, not also, but extends from Spain to India, is showing that perhaps the ancient world has another important civilizational, political, and economic center, which is the Iranian world, which is perhaps, well, Mesopotamia, Iran, and Central Asia, which is also very important. And it may be a good idea to focus a little bit more on that, even perhaps to boldly claim that that is really the heart of the ancient world, as several world historians working in later periods would absolutely maintain that in the Middle Ages, early modern periods, the real center of all cultural developments, economic developments, political developments, it all starts until at least 1500s in Central Asia and Iran. That's the region that we should be looking at. So that's something that I think is a kind of a legacy in terms of world history. Can we redefine ancient history in terms of world history, which means looking also to other regions, and not only Iran, also to India. I'm not throwing in China already up to this moment. In the Hellenistic periods, there is no direct contact. But when that exists, you can also study China. But if you think in terms of interconnected cultures and interconnected regions, and then there is direct contact between India and Spain and that whole huge area. And then perhaps the center of gravity may lie further to the east than traditional ancient history assumes. Not just during the Persian Empire, also later.
Great. Well, that's a great answer as well. And I did kind of lie because there's one more question I'm going to ask you, but I promise it's very, very easy. And that is, where can people find you if they would like to get in contact, send you an email, any of that good stuff, or check out your publications?
Thank you. I think the best way to find my publications is on the website academia.edu. I try to republish everything that I write there. Academia is a site which essentially has its flaws, but essentially it's about open access. And you can find me at my homepage at the University of Utrecht. And you can actually find me by just typing in my full name, first name and second name. It's a unique name on the internet. It will always lead you to this person. There may be more people called that, but they're not on the internet.
Perfect. Well, I will find both the academia page and your faculty page, and I will link them in the show notes so that way people can click on them and read up on all of the great things you do, and they will find your university email, I'm sure. So if they would like to send you their own questions, they will be able to. And with that, I really would like to thank you for coming and talking to me. I've been really, really looking forward to this conversation for quite a while, and I'm just really happy that we've finally been able to coordinate the schedules to make it happen.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun to do. I enjoyed it.
Legacies of Ancient Persia is a Portavood podcast production, hosted and edited by Lexi Henning, with select episodes co-hosted by Marissa Stevens. Cover art provided by Hadley Leesman and original music by Brent Arhart. Established in 2017 as the premier research center for the study of ancient Iran, the mission of the Portavood Institute for the Study of the Iranian World is to engage in transformative research on all aspects of Iranian antiquity, including its reception in the medieval and modern periods, by expanding on the traditional domains of old Iranian studies and promoting cross-cultural and interdisciplinary scholarship. Thanks for listening to our show. It's available to stream on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Portavood Institute and at Portavood UCLA, or visit our website portavood.ucla.edu. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review us. For podcast inquiries or questions about the Portavood Institute, please email us at portavoodpodcastproduction@gmail.com. We'll see you next time as we continue our deep dive into the legacies of ancient Persia.